Guess what time it is? That's right. It's once again time for me to spread my blatant pro-dog agenda. Look, it's not my fault. 6 years ago, I adopted a random mutt who turned out to be the world's cutest dog, and now I am unable to resist spreading the good news. Wait, is this a religion? Is India a prophet? Or dare I say, prophet? Anyway, I'm actually going to start with a little content warning. While most of this video is going to be lighthearted and fun and interesting, I'm going to start by talking about guns and homicides and suicides. So if you'd like to skip that bit, just jump forward to this timestamp. The reason why I have Indy is in part because 6 years ago, there was a man living about a 40-minute drive from me who made a YouTube video in which he gave out my home address and commented that I had the same first name as Rebecca Schaefer, an actress who was brutally murdered by a stalker who found her address using a public records search. I found that video because another woman contacted me saying that this man was also stalking her and had been for some time, that he had been to prison and she was working on putting him back in prison because he was very dangerous. I lived alone at the time in an apartment building with no real security and no rules that would allow me to install my own security system. So obviously, because I am an American, my first thought was, hey, I should get a gun. I am very much in favor of gun regulations, but personally, I am happy to undergo training and education and background checks. I have no moral quandary about shooting a man in the face if he enters my home to try to murder me. Unfortunately, I'm also a critical thinker, and so I know what the data shows. Like, yes, having a firearm in the home increases a person's risk of dying of homicide by threefold. And it significantly increases the risk of dying specifically of gun violence. But it seemed like my risk of dying of homicide was already significantly elevated, which is, why I was considering getting a gun. So, as a woman, having a firearm in the home, of course, would significantly increase my chances of dying of intimate partner violence. As the American Association of Family Practitioners sums up, there is a nearly 8-fold increased risk associated with gun ownership and homicide when the perpetrator is the intimate partner or a relative of the victim. If the gun owner has a history of domestic violence, the risk of homicide is 20 times higher. Women who are physically abused by current or former partners are 7 times more likely to be murdered if the partner owned a handgun compared to women whose partner does not own a handgun. But, I was single at the time and I didn't really have any interest in cohabitating with a man, abusive or otherwise, so that also wasn't a huge deal for me. But I also knew that having a firearm in the home would significantly increase the chance that I would die of suicide. 60% of all suicides involve a firearm, and homes with a firearm are much more likely to experience a successful suicide. And while those other things might not necessarily apply to me, this one, I was pretty depressed at the time. I'd just gone through a breakup. And in fact, I was working with my psychiatrist to fine-tune my anti-depression drugs, my anti-anxiety pills. And that does have the delightful side effect of increasing risk of suicide. Also, I should mention that hundreds of people die each year from unintentional firearm incidents. Not only am I a bit of a klutz, but I also experience really vivid dreams that often end up with me sleepwalking and doing random things without me realizing it. It's probably best not to give delirious, asleep Rebecca a gun to battle the alien she thinks is melting through the ceiling or whatever. So have I overshared enough for this video yet? No? Okay, let's go on. I quickly came to the conclusion that a gun is not right for me. But what might be right for me? A dog. I'd never had a dog before as an adult, but I thought that having one might help. Something like a big German Shepherd or a pit bull that might be able to bite the shit out of a potential murderer, or at least scare a potential murderer away, or at the very least make me think that the dog could do those things and thus make me at least feel safer. So I adopted a puppy who I was told was a German Shepherd mix. they thought he was not at all. He's 35 pounds and he prances when he walks. He has butt curtains and ears that flop when he walks. He always looks happy. He's ridiculous. He couldn't intimidate a xenophobic squirrel. But it turns out he does make me safer. On the one hand, he really is good at alerting me when there's a stranger around, growling if someone approaches me when I don't want them to, and scaring off door-to-door salesmen. But on the other hand, he may actually keep everyone in my neighborhood safer, at least according to a new paper titled Paws on the Street, Neighborhood Level Concentration of Households with Dogs and Urban Crime. In a survey of about 43,000 homes in and around Columbus, Ohio, researchers found that the presence of dogs in a neighborhood significantly reduced the number of property crimes like burglaries. The researchers also specifically looked at neighborhoods with a high level of trust, found by asking residents how much they trusted the average person on their street. Higher trust among neighbors is already associated with less crime in previous studies. But this one showed that even in those neighborhoods with high levels of trust, more dogs still meant less robbery, less homicide, and less aggravated assault. So what's the idea? Are all these dogs roaming around the neighborhood biting criminals? Not exactly. The researchers think that the benefit might actually be due to the dog's owners. More people walking their dogs around a neighborhood means more eyes on the street to notice things that might be out of place and to dissuade nefarious actors from committing crimes. The researchers cite the work of Jane Jacobs, and I'm so glad they did because I ended up falling down a rabbit hole and I learned a lot about a very interesting person. I had previously known about Robert Moses, who was an urban planner who is essentially a supervillain. He was an inveterate racist who is responsible for destroying Black and Latino communities in New York by bulldozing their homes, building highways that cut them off from schools and parks, and even purposely building overpasses too low for city buses to go through, meaning that if you weren't rich enough to have a car or be able to take a taxi, you simply could not travel down certain corridors to access certain places like beaches. Yeah, you thought I was being hyperbolic when I called him a supervillain, weren't you? But that's some supervillain stuff. While I was aware of Moses and his horrific legacy, I had no idea that this supervillain actually had a nemesis, Jane Jacobs, a journalist who moved to Greenwich Village in the 1930s. In 1959, Robert Moses submitted plans for the village along with the area that would become Chinatown and Little Italy to be bulldozed. 2,000 families in more than 400 buildings would be evicted, and more than 800 small businesses would be displaced for the plan. And the mostly non-white Lower Manhattan would essentially be walled off from the rest of the city. The city approved this plan in 1960. Jane Jacobs was horrified, and she leapt into action, organizing community rallies and forming the Joint Committee to Stop the Lower Manhattan Expressway, roping in people like Margaret Mead and Eleanor Roosevelt to support her. She led these protests for 10 years, fighting Moses and his lackeys tooth and nail in City Hall and at rallies and in the newspapers, with the New York Times siding with Robert Moses and the new Village Voice paper siding with the neighborhoods. By 1971, Jacobs and the neighborhood activists won, and Moses' plan was canceled. Though she had no formal education, Jacobs spent her entire life studying what makes a neighborhood a good neighborhood, what makes a city a happy place to live. She wrote one of the most influential books on urban planning, The Death and Life of Great American Cities, in which she argued that dense, mixed-use neighborhoods where people have a reason to walk around outside on the street, meeting each other and building trust, those are the neighborhoods that are safest and most likely to maintain order. That's where the concept of eyes on the street comes from, and that's why these researchers think that dogs help our neighborhoods. Anecdotally, I buy it. You know, as an adult, I've lived in dozens of different neighborhoods all over the US and even a few in London. And prior to getting indie, I never knew any of my neighbors. After, I know everybody. I know my neighbors' names. I know whether or not they like dogs. I know what they do for a living and what time they tend to be home, when they tend to go out for walks or be out in their yards. I know what their cars look like, and I know when a car is new to the neighborhood. And honestly, I never thought I would say this because I hate for people to be up in my business, but I love this. I love that my neighbors know me. They drop off extra lemons that they pick from their trees. I love heading out to the grocery store and seeing them out for a walk and asking if they want me to pick them up anything. I love that when Indy and I found another dog wandering around, we knew exactly which house he had escaped from, and we could return the little scamp. I love that last week a neighbor texted me while on vacation and asked if I could go into his house to make sure the stove was off. Trust makes me feel happier and more fulfilled, and I'm more invested in making sure that my neighborhood stays happy and healthy and safe. Obviously, bad things will still happen in neighborhoods like this. Trust and eyes on the street aren't a silver bullet. But I'd rather have those things than any bullet at all. So if you want to be safer, don't get a gun. Get a dog. Take him for a walk.